it would be great if it would work. And one big part of Internet of Things is the internet part. So stuff has to talk. And cables are shit, so we use Wi-Fi and other wireless protocols. So our next speaker is going to take a very close look at the physical layer of LoRa, a low-power wireless area network. And he built some stuff to actually sniff what's happening and inject stuff. And apparently he offered his sacrifices to the demo gods. So we'll see something. Please give a warm round of applause to Mad Knight.
Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be here. So for the next hour or so, we're going to be talking about the LoRa PHY layer. And LoRa is a low-power wide-area network wireless technology that is designed for the Internet of Things. So first, a little bit of background on myself. I'm a software engineer and a security researcher with Bastille Networks. I have a bachelor's in engineering, electrical engineering and embedded systems from Dartmouth, but really my interests are in applied RF security research. So that means everything from reverse engineering wireless protocols to developing functional basebands and software in HDL, and also all the way up to software networking stacks. So all these things are interesting to me, but I'm really excited about the material that we're going to talk about today. So before we get started, there aren't going to be any like 0 days or traditional security-related exploits here, but we are going to take apart a cutting-edge wireless protocol. We'll talk about why that's important in a minute, but first I'd just like to survey the room and get a sense for who's here so I can figure out where to spend more of my time. So if you'd be so kind as to raise your hand if you've heard of software-defined radio. That's a lot of hands. That's great. Okay, how about raise your hand if you know what a fast Fourier transform is, or an FFT. Awesome. And how about a symbol in the context of wireless systems? Okay, cool. We're going to do well. This is going to be fun. So why is this sort of network forensics interesting? Or why is it relevant? Why is this important? The Cisco Internet Business Solutions Group has a figure that I really like that states that by 2020, there are going to be 50 billion devices connected to the internet in some way. As we know, with the growth of mobile and the Internet of Things, fewer and fewer of those devices are connected with wires every year. And as we know, tools like Wireshark and monitor mode weren't always a thing. Even for common interfaces like Wi-Fi and 802.11, those tools that we come to rely on every day exist because somebody thought to look below the layer they had and make it. And I believe that low-level security or low-level access to interfaces is essential for enabling comprehensive security on various interfaces. So we're going to begin by discussing LPWANs at a high level, and then we're going to do a little bit of a background on some technical radio concepts, just so we can level out our domain knowledge and inform the rest of the conversation. Then I'm going to take you through my recent reverse engineering of the LoRa PHY layer that was powered through software-defined radio. And finally, I'm going to give you a demo of this tool called GR LoRa that I've made that is an open-source implementation of this PHY that will enable you to begin doing your own security research with it. So to begin, what is LoRa? What is this thing? It is a wireless IoT protocol. And IoT is in red because none of us are marketers. We're all engineers. We know that this is a dirty term, right? IoT is really code for connected embedded devices. And there are tons of comm standards for embedded systems already. Everything like 802.15.4 and all of its friends like Zigbee and 6LoWPAN, 802.11 Wi-Fi, and then also more common things like Bluetooth and Bluetooth Low Energy. And the list goes on, right? We've got all these standards. What is wrong with them? Why don't we just use one of these existing ones? Well, all the ones that we just mentioned all require some degree of local provisioning. You need, say, to connect your device to an SSID or hook your Zigbee device up to a coordinator in order to get it communicating. Some of them require gateways to talk out to the internet. And in the case of 802.11, it's very power intensive. So you can't run a device for a long time on a battery. So what's ideal? What about cellular? Cellular works everywhere. It's easy to install. You don't have to worry about any hardware on premises. As long as you can talk to a tower that could be miles away, you're good to go. Well, it's power intensive, and in the case of certain types of the standards, they're going away. And I'm talking about 2G, GPRS, and edge service. In the United States, AT&T, one of the largest carriers, is saying they're going to sunset their 2G network in about 3 days. In Australia, this has already happened. Telstra, which is one of the largest telecom companies in Australia, sunset their GPRS service earlier this month. and all the other major carriers are soon to follow. So 2G works everywhere, it's very battery conscious, and it's fairly cheap. So this is exactly what the Internet of Things needs to power its communication standards. Now, say you're a developer and you want to move on to a new wireless standard that won't deprecate in 3 days. You can either go to 3G or a more modern cell stack, which comes with a more expensive radio and harder power requirements, or you can wait for the 3GPP, which is the standards body that makes and maintains the cellular standards, to come out with their IoT-focused standards that are currently in development. And the indications that I've gotten state that those won't be ready until the end of next year, really at the earliest. So it's going to be the end of 2017 or the beginning of 2018 before we start to see these things in the wild, which means that until then, there's a massive hole in the market. So if you want to develop a embedded system that requires this type of connectivity, you're going to have to look elsewhere. And that brings us to the topic of low-power wide area networks. And you can think of these networks as being just like cellular, but optimized for IoT and M2M communications. The architecture is almost exactly the same, in that you have a network of base stations or gateways worldwide, and then end nodes uplink directly to those base stations without any meshing or routing among themselves. It's just like a star network, basically. You have these nodes that connect directly to the base station, and they have a range on the order of miles. So very similar topology to cellular. There are tons of standards that are popping up. There are more and more every day. But the two that have the most momentum are LoRa and Sigfox. There's been a ton of investment in both of these technologies. Actually, just last month, Sigfox closed a €150 million Series F, some late-stage funding round. In the Wall Street Journal wrote an article recently that stated that they were investigating a US IPO soon. Additionally, Senate and Actility, two of the biggest backers of the LoRa PHY, have raised a combined $51 million in the last year or two. So one firm raising $150 million, they are absolutely going for it. They're investing like crazy in these technologies. So when we say that these networks are optimized for the Internet of Things, we're really talking about two things. They're battery conscious. Sigfox advertises that they can get up to 10 years of battery on the amount of energy in a single AA battery, and they're long range. And if you turn all the knobs in LoRa just right and have a perfect, noiseless channel, they advertise that you can get 13.6 miles on one of these very long-range devices. And if you compare that with, some of the standards we talked about earlier, that's pretty competitive. So how do they do that? How does that work? Well, they've designed the entire system around the fact that they're willing to accept compromises in the protocol and the functionality of these devices. Now, when I talk about compromises, I'm talking about aggressive duty cycling, both of transmitting and listening. Very sparse datagrams, so tiny packet sizes, and they're highly rate limited, meaning they can't send that many packets that often. Now, for example, Sigfox limits, this is built into the PHY, limits devices to 140 12-byte datagrams per day. That's like nothing. I think that's less than like a UDP MTU. It's tiny. Now, and then weightless N, another LPWAN standard, is uplink only. So it can only send messages up to a gateway, but can't receive any downlink. So for example, if you had a device deployed, you could never deliver firmware to it later, unless you rolled a truck to it or climbed up the telephone pole to where it's mounted. And finally, LoRa Class A devices can only receive downlink for a brief window after they uplink. So if you're an application operator and you want to send a message to a device you have in the field, you have to wait for that device to call home before you have your brief window to tell it what you want. So these systems are built around compromises, but that's what enables them to get some pretty incredible performance. All right, let's get into the details with LoRa. So LoRa is an LPWAN that's developed by Semtech, which is a French semiconductor company. The PHY was patented in June of 2014, and the LoRa WAN Mac and network stack was published in January of 2015. So this entire standard is less than 2.5 years old. It's brand new. And it's supported by an industry trade group called the LoRa Alliance, which has tripled in size every year since its founding, so growing quite a bit. Before we move on, I just want to clear up some nomenclature that will help us focus in on what this talk is going to center on. And that is disambiguating LoRa and LoRaWAN. LoRa refers strictly to the PHY layer, the physical layer of the standard. LoRaWAN defines a MAC and a networking, some upper layer stacks that ride on top of LoRa. The LoRaWAN standard, the upper layer, has been published, and that's public. But the PHY layer itself is totally closed. So the LoRaWAN upper layer stack gives some information about its topology. It's kind of interesting. It suggests that they were really thinking about security when they designed it. There are kind of 4 stages in the network. All the way out in the field on your sensor, you have the end node, and that connects to a gateway over a wireless link. That's the LoRa link. And then once you get into the gateway, everything from there up is all on IP networks, just standard commercial IP networks. And then they have roaming that works among different networks, so you'll be able to take your device and move to different areas of coverage and have it all play nicely. And then you can hook your application server up to that as well to receive packets to and from the network servers. It's all over IP. And they actually went as far as to define 2 different mechanisms for encrypting it. There are 2 different keys. You have the network key, which covers from the end node up to the network server, and then you have the application key, which is actually fully end-to-end. It goes from the end device all the way up to the application server. So if you design that right, the network should never see your traffic unencrypted. And they also provide a mechanism for having unique keys per device. It's built into the standard, but it's not required. So it's still up to the implementer to do that and get that right. So there are some good thoughts that went into security with LoRaWAN. However, that's not what we're talking about today. That's all we're going to say about LoRaWAN. We're just going to tell you it exists, that it rides above LoRa, but we're not going to go into any more detail than that. So from here on out, it's all LoRa all the time. We're just talking about the PHY layer. So let's get into what makes that really interesting. One of the big defining features of LoRa and Sigfox, the 2 biggest LPWANs, is that they're designed to use what are called ISM spectrum. At least that's what it's called in the United States. It stands for Industrial, Scientific, and Medical. And what's cool about these bands is they're what are called unlicensed, which means that you don't need a specific license from the FCC or your telecom regulation authority to operate on it. So if you go and you buy a new Wi-Fi router on Amazon, you take it home, you plug it in, you don't need to then go and apply for a specific license to be able to communicate on it. Because it was built to a certain standard, it is compliant with those unlicensed band rules and therefore can just work. So these devices use that same spectrum, but to much greater effect, much longer ranges and in a much different use case. So that's quite novel. And some other things that use these technologies are Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cordless phones, baby monitors, things like that. So you can think of this as occupying the same space in the spectrum as these. Now, why is this noteworthy? Well, contrast it with the cellular model, where cellular technologies use protected spectrum, where you have to have specific rights to transmit on it in order to legally use it. And regulatory authorities sell the spectrum for fortunes, like billions of dollars is what the spectrum sells for in the US. I'm sure it's the same over here. And I just want to call your attention to how expensive this is. On the left here, we have a picture. It's an excerpt from a document that I found that was related to the FCC's TV whitespace reverse auction. They're trying to repurpose a lot of spectrum that used to be used for digital TV. They're selling it off. And if you want to come in and buy some really prime, low UHF spectrum to use for whatever purposes you have, mind you, this is just one TV station in the New York area, you can get out your checkbook and write a $900 million check and take over WCBS TV in New York. So getting into the cellular game is crazy expensive. It costs a fortune. But there are a lot of us in here. Maybe we can pass the hat and buy some spectrum at the end of this. So as a result of this unlicensed nature, there are a number of different models of commercialization that are starting to emerge. We have the traditional telecom-like model. We're seeing through companies like Senet, which is a company that deploys home heating oil tank monitoring solutions in the United States. They're also opening the network up for IoT applications to ride on top of that traffic as well. And you'd operate with them just like you would operate with like Verizon or AT&T or I guess Deutsche Telekom or whoever you work with here. Also interesting is I believe it's KPN has rolled out LoRa, a commercial LoRaWAN network throughout the entire region of the Netherlands. So the country is entirely covered with LoRa. So that's the commercial side. In the middle, we also have crowdsourced networks. And the one that I like to talk about is this group called the Things Network, where basically they have defined in the cloud the network server architecture for operating a worldwide LoRaWAN network. So if you want to provide LoRaWAN service on the Things Network in your area, you can get your hands on a LoRa gateway, point it at their network servers, and basically become a base station in their network from your living room. which is kind of cool. So it can kind of spread and grow organically based on the needs of people like me and you who want this sort of service. Then finally, all the way up at the kind of independent amateur side, we have people like Travis Goodspeed and some of his friends that are working on a technology called LoRa ham. And that's leveraging the fact that you can actually get LoRa radios that work around 433, which is in the, I think it's the 70 centimeter ham band in the United States. So you can actually put a reasonable amount of power behind LoRa and do text-based communications in the clear. So they're developing a LoRa-based mesh networking system for doing basic like ASCII packet radio and communicating. It's not public yet, but he's blessed me to come and tell you that he's working on this, and it should be out soon. So there are all sorts of different ways to use these technologies. So this is a very different paradigm with what we're used to, and it's opening up lots of different opportunities for how this technology might be used and grow. Okay, so that wraps up our background on LoRa. We're about to get into some really technical stuff, but before we do, I want to go through a very short crash course on some basic radio fundamentals to try to even the playing field so that we can all understand this. And I call it the obscenely short radio crash course, but with apologies to any PhDs or real telecom whizzes in the room, I think this is probably more appropriate. We're gonna blow through this material, and I'm just gonna try to pick out a few points that are really essential to understanding the rest of this talk. I'll tell you what's important, and just try to grab those concepts, and we'll reiterate them later as we go through it. So again, we're going to be talking about the physical layer. And if you think about the OSI data model that we've all seen, the physical layer refers to how your bits, your